The Prime Minister will leave for the European Council in Brussels. There, the war in Ukraine will be discussed. A war which, as we've been saying for over 10 years now, is not our war. The European Union chair sees it differently. In fact, for the European Union, the war in Ukraine is a matter of life and death, because how else would the European Union justify its grab for power without that supposed Russian threat? That is to say, the ongoing harmonization of the member states, an increase in the European budget, the multi-annual financial framework, by more than 50% to over 2 trillion euros. The further restriction of our veto rights in all kinds of areas, including even foreign policy. And of course, not to forget the rearmament of Europe under the slogan Rearm Europe. The European Union chair can only justify and legitimize all of this because there is supposedly a big, bad enemy, Russia. And so for the European Union, it is of the utmost importance that this enemy continues to exist, and chair, that stands in the way of achieving lasting peace. After all, nothing is as unifying as a common enemy. The European Union, the EU as a power apparatus, therefore has a great interest in this war continuing. But that is not in our interest, not in the Dutch interest. And the upcoming European Council in Brussels is not the first time, Chair, that the Prime Minister is abroad. It strongly appears that our Prime Minister is more often abroad than in the Netherlands. Right shortly after taking office, he immediately went to Ukraine and then traveled, among other places, to Brussels, Poland, France, the Caribbean, and the United States. And although, Chair, this will not surprise you, Forum naturally finds this undesirable, we do understand it. We do understand it. After all, the Prime Minister does not represent Dutch interests abroad, but rather the globalist interests within the Netherlands. And this is against the will of the Dutch people. Globalists who, for example, want to achieve a political unification of the European Union, which the Dutch people rejected in a referendum on June 1st, 2005.
Before I give the floor to Ms. Becker, Chair, I would like to point out to Mr. Van Houwelingen that the 3 different countries and the public bodies are part of the Kingdom of the Netherlands. So that is actually, I just want to mention it for the record, Ms. Becker.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Van Houwelingen from Forum for Democracy is rather dismissive about Ukraine. What does he think of the recent terrible destruction in Kyiv, where 4 people were killed, 23 were injured, including a pregnant woman, and a historic monastery complex was destroyed?
Mr. Van Houwelingen.
Yes, Chair, so this is the level of this House of Representatives. Yes, war is terrible, that is the question. Yes, I think war is terrible. So if that's the question, it is horrific on both sides. As I've said repeatedly, it's dreadful for Ukraine, a country being destroyed in this proxy war, which only our party in this House strongly opposes. That's why I'm very proud that we weren't here when Zelensky gave a speech here. So yes, I think it's terrible. Yes, Chair, if that's the question. I think war is terrible, yes.
Ms. Becker.
Chair, Mr. Van Houwelingen says he finds it terrible and at the same time calls it our proxy war and talks about it being terrible on both sides. Is that also what is discussed with the Russian ambassador who Forum for Democracy simply invites to the party Congress? And is that actually the story that we're hearing here?
Mr. Van Houwelingen.
Yes, I'm very proud of that, Chair. We talk to everyone. That's exactly what Forum for Democracy is all about. So we talk with Ukraine, if possible, with Russia, with everyone, and there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, I would like this chamber to do the same. That's what we do, instead of being accused of seeking information, because we don't pick sides. Look, that's the big difference. So the VVD indeed chooses the side of the European Union, of Ukraine. Yes, Ukraine. By the way, what is Ukraine, Chairman, if I may ask? That country is as divided as it can possibly be. That's why we were already against that association agreement, which has only further split that country, something we were so strongly opposed to. And back then we already campaigned, even then with the slogan, "Don't do this because this will lead to war." And it has become war. Yes, and we are very much against war, Chairman.
Concluded.
Chairman, how can you say that? The VVD chooses the side of Ukraine. We do not choose a side. So apparently Forum just lovingly protects Russia, the country that was responsible for the downing of MH17, the country that is responsible for the fact that in Ukraine every day men have to leave their families to fight at the front for our safety. And when Mr. Van Houwelingen says we talk to everyone, well then there is a significant inconsistency in his argument. Because when Mr. Zelensky comes here to the House of Representatives, who fights every day for our safety, Forum for Democracy is not present. So talking to everyone is not actually happening. It's not a question, Chairman, but I hope that everyone watching this debate realizes very well where Forum for Democracy stands. And that is on the side of Russia and not on the side of the Netherlands or the EU.
Mr. Van Houwelingen.
Yes, we've already explained that. We were not there. We would have been there, Chairman, if we had actually been able to ask a question, because it was, of course, a propaganda stunt. It really has been a disgrace for this entire Parliament that this was allowed to happen. If we had been able to ask questions, I say through the Chairman to Mrs. Becker. Mrs. Becker is right. You aren't siding with Ukraine. The VVD and most parties here, except the FVD, sacrifices Ukraine in a proxy war. That is what you are doing, and Ukraine is the great victim of this.
Mr. van der Lee.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. I have no question. I just have an observation that the Dutch people do not feel represented by Forum for Democracy because the Dutch people wholeheartedly support the European Union, wholeheartedly support Ukraine, and even a majority supports Ukraine's membership in the European Union.
Yes, that's also simply not true. Mr. van der Lee probably bases that on, we've been in this debate together on the Eurobarometer, which I have debated extensively. This is a survey that is completely unreliable. The only times the Dutch people have really been able to express themselves on this were twice. That was June 1st, 2005. At that time, the Dutch people voted against the European Constitution. I've said that many times already. So against the EU and the Lisbon Treaty, the Dutch people voted on April 6, 2016. They ultimately rejected that association agreement. We won that as well. So the Dutch people have spoken out twice, and both times they agreed with us. Mr. van der Lee, I say this through the chair. So yes, I think that in this respect, we are the only party here representing the Dutch people.
Mr. van der Lee, but I suggest that we soon continue with the European Summit of June 18th and 19th, and that you also let the debate focus on that. That's kind of the idea of the debate we're having with each other, Mr. van Houwelingen. Finally, Mr. van der Lee.
Yes, I agree with the Chairman. But look, Forum may claim a victory from 10 years ago, but the reality is completely different. And fortunately, the Dutch people understand that very well. And not just the Dutch people, but the European people as well. We have to support Ukraine. We need Ukraine. The Russian threat is real. It's horrific what they are doing in Ukraine, and we have no idea yet what might be in store for us.
Yes, very briefly. Yes, one of the problems is that the Dutch population is very poorly informed, not only by our media, but also, for example, by censorship imposed by the European Union. They can't form an opinion from another perspective because, for example, Russian channels are banned. That's the state of this country, Chair. Nothing I can do, and I won't. I'm just going to continue.
Yes.
I'm going to skip a part. You'll be pleased with me for that because it's already been addressed. What the Dutch people want is therefore not leading for this cabinet. I've just given the examples of those two referendums, for instance. And this Prime Minister. And then, Chair, as Prime Minister, you naturally take your guidelines from abroad because that's where these red lines are drawn, after all. As former Prime Minister Rutte once stated during a press conference, the footage exists. The House of Representatives or the Dutch people certainly do not determine these red lines. That is very clear, as is shown time and again. And that's why I understand it, Chair. I do understand that this Prime Minister, while our country is literally and figuratively on fire, spends so much time traveling abroad. Brussels is more important to him than The Hague. And not just Brussels, Chair. The globalist consensus is also manufactured by, for example, the World Economic Forum or the Bilderberg Foundation. Private organizations that are not accountable to any parliament and whose discussions remain completely out of sight. Last April, Chair, the Prime Minister, together with the King and his wife, attended the Bilderberg Conference in Woersten. In response to this, Chair, we submitted a very simple yes or no question to the Prime Minister in writing. Were the Prime Minister, King and Queen present there in a personal capacity, or were they representing the Netherlands? After waiting more than 6 weeks, we did not receive a yes or no answer, but instead a procedural explanation that in no way addressed this simple question. So once again, Chair, my first, only and final question today to the Prime Minister. A simple yes or no question. Did the King and the Prime Minister represent the Netherlands during the Bilderberg Conference last April in Woersten? Or were they there in a personal capacity? Thank you.